On the one hand, the ancient city-state, the Germanic commune, and feudalism presuppose the great empires and cannot be understood except in terms of the Urstaat that serves as their horizon. On the other hand, the problem of confronting these forms is to reconstitute the Urstaat insofar as possible, given the requirements of their new distinct determinations. For what do private property, wealth, commodities, and classes signify? The breakdown of codes. The appearance, the surging forth of now decoded flows that pour over the socius, crossing it from one end to the other. The state can no longer be content to overcode territorial elements that are already coded and must invent specific codes for flows that are increasingly deterritorialized, which means putting despotism in the service of the new class relations, integrating the relations of wealth and poverty, of commodity and labor, reconciling market money and money from revenues, everywhere stamping the mark of the Urstaat on the new state of things. And everywhere, the presence of the latent model that can no longer be equaled, but one cannot help but imitate. The Egyptians' melancholy warning to the Greeks echoes through history. You Greeks will never be anything but children.
The very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is the whole state of things, the pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to the Machine Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins. As always, we are sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Before we get started with today's discussion, come visit us at www.patreon.com/MUHH and send us a buck a month. Today, we are going back to Anti-Oedipus Chapter 3, Sections 8 and 9 on the Urstaat and the Capitalist Machine. Coop, how are we doing today?
Very well, very well. I thought this was this at least starting chapter on the Urstaat was a fun start to the reading, I think. I enjoyed that a lot. Gets progressively more difficult as you close out chapter 3, but this at least first section is fairly, I think, manageable in terms of the difficulty of the material. Yes,
and we're going to do our best to unpack.
Yeah,
it's just one of the words that like unpacking a text is this phrase that you pick up from like getting an English degree. You have to like use that phrase, whenever you talk about trying to like parse difficult sections, and you're hermeneutically like trying to excavate little fragments of meaning and
extract a little surplus.
That's right. Yeah.
A little surplus code.
I have heard colleagues and friends that say they hate the term unpack, but I don't necessarily hate it. I just know that it's one of those words that's like branded on my cerebrum.
Elucidate is a good synonym.
Yep.
But yeah, it just doesn't. I don't know. It's not as it's a difficult for pronunciation.
Elucidate is definitely a part of unpacking, but elucidate is almost a little too courageous or a little too it's a good word for it. It's a little not arrogant, but presupposing that you'll be successful in your unpacking and that you will be able to actually perform the gesture. You started off, the cold open is a great quote, and this notion of the breakdown of codes is interesting, right? We kind of are. You can see that as we get deeper and deeper into chapter 3, that they are not only performing a genealogy of the state and of the Urstaat, but at the same time, or because this is a part of their theory of the development of the socius and its different instantiations, we're seeing a kind of genealogy of codes and flows.
Yeah.
Right. We're seeing how they evolve, or a better word for it, how they drastically change from each machine, each socius machine. We started with the territorial machine, which is the socius is meant to code the flows that flow over the body of the organs of the earth. We see that in the despotic machine, This becomes a new mode where it is about overcoding, because now we have erection of the despot. We have
the erection of the
we have
despot.
dominated peoples, right?
That's very phallic, right? The erection of the despot.
Mm-hmm. And so now we're getting into this question of decoded flows, of flows that are increasingly more deterritorialized and decoded, and the breakdown of codes, as they say, right? Which they even put in italics.
On this note of decoded flows, to me, it almost seems like kind of looking at the modern, contemporary, let's say, I guess, political, at least nominally political declarations that people make, right? People that identify with the right or left. I think there's a certain overlap in those groups that appear to share this idea of, or like they seem to be repulsed by the decoded flows, or like they want to code the flows. There seems to be an obsession that crosses both sides of the political spectrum, if you're going to simplify to this binary, I guess. And this seems to be the primary, to me, split between politics. People that want coded flows and people that want to allow more coded flows within the socius.
It's interesting, right? We've talked about this a little bit, especially when we discussed Lyotard. You know, one of his opening theses in The Postmodern Condition is this notion that capital doesn't care about nation states, and yet they are still a part of our political reality. And they are, just to use Deleuze and Guattari's terms, they are kind of residual reterritorializations of capital. You know, in a certain sense, capital doesn't really care what monetary form it comes in, what face is stamped on on its
currency,
on its bills, on its currency. But we still have these nationalities, these states, for which it has a complex relation, as we'll kind of see in the next section. You know, don't just to anticipate a little bit, where they kind of say, on the one hand, the state is kind of forming a type of limit or blockage for the absolute deterritorialization that capital should imply, as it continuously expels or pushes back, displaces its limit as it comes towards it. But on the other hand, the state also forms this means of appropriating the surplus value. And so one of my favorite little quotes they have, which they put in parentheses, almost as an aside, it's like the Second World War achieved through the military industrial complex what the New Deal couldn't.
Right.
We'll get into that. We'll have to save some time for the next section, but let's start with this notion of the Urstaat. And you did a little bit of background reading on the city of Ur, right? Let's maybe start there and talk about this famous biblical.
Right. Yeah. City. So this is supposedly the birthplace of Abraham, obviously the father patriarch, the phallus, if you will, of the Abrahamic religions.
Mm-hmm.
Supposedly this exists in the city was within Mesopotamia, the Sumerian, more or less. I mean, I don't know because I think there's the Chaldeans, or
I always pronounce it Chaldeans, but I could be wrong.
I don't know.
Chaldeans. I've never talked to archaeological friends. I don't have many of those, but yeah, it's where Abraham was born, and as they say, it's kind of they take that name and they attach to the Urstaat. You know, as we've seen that we've talked about it a little bit. It comes fully armed, kind of like Athena out of the head of Zeus, right? It's this interesting notion where it's like the state didn't necessarily come about at a certain time in history. It's sort of always been there, even in these proto forms.
I think a good metaphor, I was maybe DMing you or posting about this week, was the xenomorph from Aliens. You know, it's like you have, I guess, it's a slightly different, right? Because you have the overcoding of the face hugger, right? Is overcoding this, whatever, the
biological entity that is parasiting off
entity. But then it works in the sense that, you know, the alien sort of erupts all at once, right? Like it's not this progressive thing. Well, I mean, I guess it sort of is, right? Because it grows following that, but at least there's a definitive rupture,
right,
through obviously the famous scene. So I don't know if that kind of helps to sort of.
This gets more detail in the Prometheus movies too, right? You know, just the notion of the alien xenomorphs kind of always haunting the humanoid intelligent species.
The inhuman, yeah. The inhuman.
Yeah, it's the inhuman within
outside.
the human, right? Yeah. Yeah. So, it's interesting that they state right at the very beginning of this section that it's the site of the new alliance, right? As you said, Abraham being the father of the monotheistic Abrahamic religions, he enters this covenant with God who promises him. And at the time, he didn't have legitimate children. He may have already had Ishmael with Hagar.
Yeah.
And that may have already happened when he's promised that his seed or his offspring will outnumber the stars in the sky, right? It's something, God says something like that, which seems very hard to believe, if you will, for where Abraham is at that point.
Yeah, certainly.
And at the time before the covenant, right? I mean, his name is Abram. So part of the covenant is his name changes too. So that's a part of the alliance. Obviously, the ritual of circumcision as the mark and the inscription of holding the promise becomes a tradition and sets his offspring apart, right? That they are part of the chosen people, so to speak, for this new alliance.
I'm almost certain that God directs Abraham to lay with Hagar to produce the offspring because of Sarah was like barren, allegedly, or something like that.
Right.
The wife of Abraham was Sarah, if for those of you that are not biblically aligned, let's say.
I believe that's true. I'd have to revisit my Bible school notebooks, but
I'm almost certain that the Genesis lays that out very straightforwardly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But this was at God's behest.
Right.
And I think even God addresses Sarah and like gets her on board with him with this whole thing, which is kind of odd.
God gives him several demands or several commands, one of which is to pretty much, I don't know how to say it, to trick the Pharaoh, right? In a way that will increase his flock and his peoples and his wealth. He introduces Sarah as his sister for Pharaoh to lay with as a concubine or whatever. And God kind of gets angry, and the Pharaoh's, God, just go away, take your sister and take some flocks of goats and sheep, and kind of increases his wealth in this way of.
Well, that wouldn't be Pharaoh, would it? Because this predates.
Was it not the Pharaoh, or was it just some royal?
I was probably one of these
underling
Chaldeans or Babylonian. I don't, like I said, I'm not sure of the history of the groups, but I think ancient Sumeria could be like, at least that's within the ballpark of the time frame that we're speaking of. Now, the Egyptian, that flows later through Moses. Joseph. Well, Moses, preceding Moses, because you had the 12 tribes of Israel, Jacob, and
but that's through Abraham's line.
Right. Yes. Correct. Yeah. Correct. Yes, absolutely. Mm-hmm. Chronologically, what happens is I think Joseph is sold into slavery. He winds up rising up within the Egyptian state. And then because
he solves the problem of the drought with his dream.
Correct. Yes. And so as part of that whole narrative, the brothers come to Egypt seeking out grain due to the thing, and he recognizes them. And so that sort of, I guess, is the impetus for how the events that lead sort of to Exodus over the centuries or whatever time period. I'm not sure what time period even passes between Joseph.
Yeah, we're showing our religious dilettantism, but yeah. So this is where the notion of comes from, and I mentioned to you before that this notion of Urstaat is, Pierre Claster says in the Influx Roundtable, which is found in the Chaosophy volume, he says that this is the chief new conceptualization, the conceptual creation that they bring in this chapter. That's something that is worth dealing with and worth contemplating for ethnologists and anthropologists. Deleuze himself says in an interview that this was one of Guattari's many conceptual creations that was, I believe it's in the same area where he talks about when he first meets Guattari, and Guattari is talking about desiring machines, and Deleuze is kind of talking about Guattari being light years ahead of where he was when he was writing Logic of Sense. And that's kind of something that made Deleuze be like, I got to work with this guy,
Right.
And we have talked about that. He said elsewhere that Guattari did the majority, the bulk of the writing, and Deleuze would more or less play a role of editor,
contributing editor,
which he's probably being. He's also probably being.
He's deflecting a bit of his own,
minimizing his own additions, because you
Right.
can see a lot of Deleuze's ideas throughout the
Right.
work.
It does feel like,
yeah.
I don't know. I mean, Deleuze is a fantastic writer. He's a brilliant writer. And I feel like you can tell the sections where it's Guattari and where it's Deleuze.
Sometimes you can. Sometimes I definitely think there are parts where you can definitely tell, okay, this has a more Deleuzean ring to it. This sounds like stuff he's worked out in his monographs.
Yeah, exactly.
The stuff on Nietzsche, for example, is very dear to Deleuze's heart. But then a lot of the other stuff, you can see that it doesn't necessarily sound like Deleuze. And again, they themselves are modest by saying, like, look, none of us is singular. We were already these multiplicities. And so you put us together, we're an assemblage, we're a crowd. They would probably both look down on us for trying to be like, okay, where's Guattari's name signed on this page and where's Deleuze's? They would discourage that. But I still think it is interesting to talk about.
If I might, this isn't really going to necessarily go too far, but I do just kind of want to bring this up because I think it's interesting just in the way that they conceive of, the social formations. Reminds me very much of, in biology, I believe there was a sort of two theories of how evolution functions. It's like, and I've mentioned this before, is that there's the phyletic gradualism and there's the punctuated equilibrium model, where it's almost like they're describing like the state emerging fully armed is basically this punctuated equilibrium. It's like sort of like at that one moment where things are crystallized versus this sort of very linear process that I think is an antiquated model for how change occurs within systems, let's say.
We've talked about it a little bit, but whenever they say evolution, whether it be biological or anthropological, sociological, they mean it in a very different sense than in the way in which evolutionism tended to predominate in classical sociology and sort of the earliest text, which, as Classer says, has a type of ethnocentrism that has to be brought to its own self-critique, right? It has to be able to be pointed out and deconstructed and all of that. As they start the chapter off by saying, like, look, universal history is contingent, ironic, singular, all this. And so they ask the question over and over, why capitalism not happen in China in 14th century, 13th century, which we discussed last time.
Last week, yeah. Not last week.
But yeah, I mean, I think this is interesting to think that it reminds me a lot of, I forget where he says it. I think it's in Logic of Sense where Deleuze says, like, once you have a bit of language, once you have any part, it's everything. It's all there. It's kind of all or nothing with,
right.
For Deleuze with language. And it seems like, they do say that, it's always existed, but it is kind of like that, where it's like, it's, as we
like
said,
in a a priori fashion, in a transcendent. Well,
they say it's the basic formation on the horizon throughout history. So, I mean, in a certain sense, it is kind of, it's like once you have a bit of the state, it's all there. And this is part of what Clastres himself says when he's like, look, there's no such thing as a pure nomad. There's always a formation of stock back at the encampment. And it's not just following pure flows. That's kind of a fantasy. So I think that involved in that already is kind of call it proto state, but that's not the word they use here. That's just my way of trying to find other words for it. And so in essence, the Urstaat is kind of like the model, right, for all the states that we have found in history. So in that sense, yeah, as you used the word, I believe just a second ago, it's kind of a transcendental, if you will.
It has an immanence. Wait,
and
no,
that
I'm thinking of not immanence. I'm thinking
of
the later on in the chapter when they're talking about.
Well, no,
they
will talk about that. That's right. But it's kind of the Urstaat is kind of the description of the conditions of possibility for any state whatsoever. Right. Yeah. I think that's kind of the way I would understand it. But it is interesting. Where's this language of the punctuated equilibrium and the phyletic gradualism?
I vaguely just recall this from maybe from biology.
That's cool. I think it works here. Yeah. So it does work here.
I mean, it's certainly the punctuated equilibrium follows the model of desire desiring production the way that they outline, I think, right? Because it's in fits and starts. It's not this smooth curve or whatever you have. It just kind of crystallized for me. What they're saying is it's all about this notion of these forms being completely contingent and not locked into this linear progression,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Just in terms of their kind of historical materialist roughly approach, I guess, is like, what's the meme with the blocks? It's the first one is this tiny little block, and then it ascends up to a giant block. So that's the
domino effect.
The domino effect is sort of what they're arguing against in a sense, in the linearity of time.
Yes. Yeah. That's too
neat,
easy.
Tidy.
It's too easy. Yeah. It's too clean, right? It's a kind of hygienicized and asepticized version of history. So yeah, I can see how punctuated equilibrium is a biological term, but it works here, provided certain analogies being made. But it's interesting that, again, this kind of points to the transcendental part where they say on page 219 about how it's not like any other historical break, the Urstaat or the development of the state, which they normally put in capital S, where they say, this is why Marxism didn't know quite what to make of it. It has no place in the famous 5 stages: primitive communism, ancient city-states, feudalism, capitalism, socialism. And they put in italics, it is not one formation among others, nor is it the transition from one formation to another. They call it a cerebral ideality, which again is an interesting way of putting it. It's a cerebral ideality that is added to, superimposed on the material evolution of societies, a regulating idea or principle of reflection, terror, that organizes the parts and the flows into a whole. And then you can go on, but there's this interesting notion that...
Do you have an understanding of how this works? To clarify, that it's not like any other historical break.
Yeah, the way I kind of understand it is they kind of say this thing where it's not something that comes from the outside in the sense in which we understood the despotic state, that it kind of happens off to the side, alongside. It forms this model, I keep using that word, but it forms this sort of way in which the elements of the socius they kind of come into this reciprocal interaction. There's a great quote to unpack this, where this is on 221, and it's this long list of things where they say the state was first this abstract unity that integrated sub-aggregates functioning separately. It is now subordinated to a field of forces whose flows it coordinates and whose autonomous relations of domination and subordination it expresses. It is no longer content to overcode territorialities. It must invent new codes for the decoded flows of money, commodities, and private property. It no longer of itself forms a ruling class or classes. Is itself formed by these classes? Yada, 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 right? It's this way in which, as you used the word earlier, the state becomes imminent to the state with a capital S, the Urstaat, as this model, as this transcendental principle becomes integrated and becomes imminent to social formations, to the socius. Does that make sense?
So internalized within, which makes sense, right? Because if it erupts out of nowhere, in a sense, the seeds have to already be sort of present. Like, are they saying that it doesn't come from outside, but it exists on the periphery of the existing socius?
It seems like it's...
I mean, you gave the example of the stores within the nomadic model.
Yeah.
And that kind of ties in, but I don't know.
Well, it's...
Because it's also it's a contingent formation too, which I don't know how to square the imminent and the contingent element exactly.
The thing is, it seems like the contingency is in the conjunctions of encounters. And from what I'm getting is that the Urstaat is a way of understanding the different social formations and how everything starts to integrate. We could think of it as a part-whole relation. What helped me a lot was when they refer to Marx and the Grundrisse. There, Marx kind of says, it's only when the forces are developed in a concrete enough way that we can understand the abstract elements of it, right? So this is
almost like a Hegelian sort of right?
Yeah, the way they end this whole list on 221, they say, in brief, and I think they're talking about the Urstaat, it does not cease being artificial, but it becomes concrete. It tends to concretization while subordinating itself to the dominant forces. The existence of an analogous evolution has been demonstrated for the technical machine when it ceases to be an abstract unity or intellectual system reigning over separate subaggregates to become a relation that is subordinated to a field of forces operating as a concrete physical system. So this tendency to concretization in the social or technical machine, they basically say it's the movement of desire.
Yeah.
That desire is what makes the Urstaat this imminent principle.
Yeah, because they talk about how Marx conceived of history moving from abstract to concrete as well.
In my head, this is kind of a scrambled notion. I think that it's that if that is true, it is only from the development of the concrete. It's only from the concretization that one can see that movement from the abstract to the concrete, right? So it's only from, so even if the Urstaat is this, it's the idea, what is it, the cerebral ideality, we can only see that in retrospect from capitalism's point of view.
Yeah,
you can't see the Urstaat from within the despotic regime.
Yeah, right? While it's sort of in gestating, let's say.
Right. So it's also only from capitalism's point of view that we can understand private property, commodity production, et cetera, right? All of these abstract things, or even like the decoding of the flows of free labor and the decoding of abstract quantities of money. It's only from our modern capitalist perspective that we could see that eventuality, even if it comes into, even if that conjunction was necessary for capitalism, you can't necessarily see it as it's happening, right? So it is. Yeah. This and is why
you don't even have a concept. You don't have the conceptual tools to identify the forces within the social at that point, because they're
at least not as a field, at least not as an integrated field. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So I think that's how I understand the Urstaat, is that it's only from, this is why they say history is not just universal. History is not just critical. It's not just singular. It's not just ironic, but it's also retrospective, right? It's the retrospective part. I think that it's from our point of view that we can see the Urstaat as the cerebral ideality, right? That kind of allows us to see how the abstract becomes concrete, right? And how they aren't in opposition, but kind of more in cahoots, right? They're collaborating. And Guattari tries to do the same thing in The Machine of Conscious, where he rails against René Thom and his thermodynamic view of sort of understanding development by saying that for the kind of semiotic approach that he is describing, it's wrong to rank the abstract on the one side and the concrete on the other, like a kind of binary that would privilege one over the other, right? That for Guattari, the abstract and the concrete, this is particularly important for 1,000 Plateaus, where the abstract machine becomes this hard to define but interesting way of thinking about the conjunction of of non-form matters and sort of immaterial forces kind of coming together in these kind of monstrous collaborations. And I kind of see the Urstaat as if it's always on the horizon for the social formations, it's only from our belated point of view that we can even perceive that horizon, right? That we can even articulate it. And they say at the end of the section, they talk about the two aspects of a becoming of the state, again with a capital S. Its internalization in a field of increasingly decoded social forces forming a physical system, its spiritualization in a supra-terrestrial field that increasingly overcodes, forming a metaphysical system. This is the hour of the greatest cynicism, that repressed cruelty of the animal man made inward and scared back into himself, the creature imprisoned in the state so as to be tamed. So it's a model, it's a kind of a transcendental model for understanding the becoming of states. And I think becoming there is a better word than evolution.
Yeah, you're
right.
Yeah.
It's
for sure.
But this is a good question. And this is something that I'm not going to say they could have been clearer about. I mean, Deleuze and Guattari themselves kind of say, like, we have to be more direct. We have to be more we have to be less stuffy and less intimidating, right? With this big tome, because Anti-Oedipus is a very fucking difficult book.
Right.
But, this notion of, as you said yourself, Marx recognized that there was indeed a way in which history proceeded from the abstract to the concrete. And this is, I think, the Grunrisse quote that I was talking about. The simple categories are the expression of relations within which the less developed concrete may have already realized itself before having posited the more many-sided connection or relation which is mentally expressed in the more concrete category, while the more developed concrete preserves the same category as a subordinate relation. So it's this interesting way in which we can retrospectively see how there is this movement of the concrete that is forming more and more dimensions in its relation, in its relationality, and is able to subordinate the different forces into a concrete whole.
So something like, I guess, religion, some type of, I was talking about in the pre-show about the, what is it, Göbekli Tepe?
Yeah.
Which is like, I think the oldest known man-made structure. It's theorized that, so this is a place, it's like a Neolithic site in Turkey where they discovered these sort of, I guess they were pillars of stone that were carved with like stone tools and have animal designs and so forth on them. And they found these vats as well at the sites. The theories are that tribes would gather at this specific hilltop and they would basically feast. So sort of like the potlatch sort of discussions we've been having relative to Anti-Oedipus, symbolic exchange, the cluster, society against the state, all of that sort of fits within this kind of discussion, I think. The interesting idea that's been posited, and this is not super revolutionary, but so they theorized that the development of basically having enough beer, like they found residue of what could potentially be beer within these vats. And so the theory goes that as part of this feasting process, the need to supply the tribes with enough beer led to sort of a type of institution of agriculture, and this potentially could be the sort of, I don't know, what would you call it? The proto-state, or a way that the proto-state would have formed.
It is interesting to think about it as it's groups of nomadic hunters, right? Tribes, clans, however you want to call it, that are meeting to form a more, let's not say a more perfect union, but to form a higher or wider union, a confederacy to a certain extent, a loose confederacy, right? I mean, I don't have a good word for it, a conjunction of stocks and flows, right? I mean, if everybody's bringing something to the table, like a potluck, I mean, you use the word potlatch, but in our modern idea of everybody bringing a little bit of something for everyone to share, everyone to get a little surplus from each other. And it is interesting. I mean, you brought up religion, but this notion of it being the world's first temple, right? A sanctuary and a means for religious celebration. I mean, in the broadest, loosest sense, it doesn't have to be.
I don't even know if I'd characterize it that way, but potentially yes. But even just the feast sort of thing,
right?
Like even just at that level alone, I think there's enough sort of metastable ground perhaps for this to arise without even religion as a sort of,
as we know it
existing.
Yes.
Yeah.
I guess I was thinking about how in one of his lecture courses, Deleuze talks about religion not as ideological, but as a means of coding. We could even think about it as a cerebral ideality of coding, right? Of providing codes for means of conduct, means of activity, means of gathering, means of
production. Honestly,
means of production too.
Thinking about this
and consumption.
Because think about this in terms of how in tune with the astrological phenomenon, etc., relative to planting, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, I guess that's a bit further forward within, but I don't know. We could speculate perhaps that to some degree this sort of technological machines exist in some fashion, perhaps.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean this is one of the first social machines we know of. So whether we call it a proto-state or one of the first states, I think of it as, I mean, it's definitely one of the first gatherings of people that could be called a city. it's hard to say if it even functioned like that in terms
Right.
of a sedentary. It provided a model for what we understand by a sedentary distribution of land, of actually like cutting out a region, which is interesting insofar as it's a nomadic city, right? It itself is sedentary,
Right.
but the
tribes themselves,
the tribes aren't necessarily dwelling within it, but it does cut out a region, right?
Yeah.
It distributes space.
There's a certain territorialization, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Effectively, right? Marking of space. This is a sort of sacred communal space.
Yep. And you brought up Stonehenge earlier, and Stonehenge is interesting because it's not just, as far as we know, it's not merely an edifice for like druidic religious rituals. It also has a practical function, as we've come to learn from science, based on its positioning. It is potentially, at least we think, if it has a practical function besides
technical machine.
Not that religion isn't practical, as we said, because
that's true.
As I mentioned, it's about coding, but it potentially allowed for astronomical observations, and in that sense could be a much broader use to social organization and planning, and
which would be tied to mode of production,
agricultural planning, right? I would assume that there would be a lot of different functions if we reduce it to function, and not just, even celebrating and gathering together has these functions of a kind of, as you said, a kind of gift economy, of a kind of circulation of goods and exchange. And we still don't really know enough about this site. It does say that only 5% of it has been excavated. So, it's kind of the tip of the iceberg.
On a tangent, if anyone's interested, the size and extent of the structures are really immense. And this is Neolithic era. So there's no metal tools. This is all done by hand with stone tools.
Mm-hmm.
And they achieve these sort of fairly large, like 15-meter high cutouts and shit. It's wild. With rocks, man, just bashing a man in a rock.
Where there's a will, there's a way, right?
Exactly, right.
It's
So writing comes first, which is interesting, right?
It's
almost like writing comes first. Marking comes first.
Well, yeah. The writing in the broadest sense, right? Yeah.
Inscription territorialization. Yeah. They found different animal sigils. I'll describe them as shorthand in different areas of the site and that's the sort of evidence for this potential being a place where multiple different clans would come and feast or do some type of ritual, or this is all highly speculative. But
yeah, here they talk about it in terms of latency, right? That it is like an abstraction that belongs to another dimension, always at a remove and struck by latency, but that springs back and returns stronger than before in the later forms that lend it a concrete existence, a protean state. Yet there has never been but one state. Almost a contradiction in terms, but that goes again to it being a kind of transcendental model. Again, not the words they use, but just trying to groping at other descriptions. There's a footnote. I don't know if you grabbed it. Not an endnote, but a footnote. It's on 222. Did you see this? Because they talk about Christianity taking over the Roman state, right? At a certain point, we've talked about this, where Constantine sees that the state religion of Rome isn't really working out, and fighting the Christians isn't really working out, and it's actually giving them more ammunition. So the state machine kind of appropriates Christianity, and they kind of, Deleuze and Guattari kind of say that there are those who wanted to, the Christian state, there are those who wanted to just take over the empire, and obviously that's part of what we got. We know that history, the Holy Roman Empire being even much later, but
it wasn't Holy Roman or an empire. Is the funny thing about it.
Yeah. But then there were the others that they say there were purists who wanted a fresh start in the wilderness, a new beginning for a new alliance, a rediscovery of the Egyptian and Syriac inspiration that would provide the impetus for a transcendent Urstaat.
The first anarcho-primitives.
Yeah, right. They wanted to. It says, in this sense, Christianity was able to develop a whole set of paranoiac and celibate machines, a whole string of paranoiacs and perverts, who also form part of our history's horizon and people our calendar. And then the footnote, as you see, talking about, first come the gentle paranoiacs who install themselves close to a village, then withdraw into the desert where they invent astonishing ascetic machines expressing their struggle against the old alliances and affiliations, the St. Anthony stage. Next, communities of disciples are formed, monasteries where one of the main activities is to write the life of the founding saint. Celibate machines with a military discipline where the monk reconstructs around him in the form of ascetic and collective constraints the aggressive universe of the old persecutions, which, as we know from a lot of the history of Christianity, the one way God cares about you and your destiny is the fact that you are facing trials and tribulations and persecutions. And then finally, the return to the city or village, armed groups of perverts who assign themselves the task of struggling against the dying paganism. Points to a text there. But I thought that was kind of interesting to think about. That's part of the history of Christianity, is not just taking over the state and its functions, even to the point of kind of being a anti-state, as we know in the history of Europe, right, with the way the Catholic Church functioned with with the Pope and the anti-Pope, and who gets to crown the rightful king and who gets to kind of dictate the destiny of these nation states, right? That kind of struggle. It is interesting to think about the monks and the ascetics and the paranoiacs that want to start fresh, start a new alliance.
What do you think about, this is kind of running a little bit with this emergence of, or this discussion of Christianity, but the Oedipal sort of triangle of Christianity in itself, we're just thinking about this, about the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, and how that ties into the infinite debt that is taken on, and
right,
etc. through, right? Because we owe this infinite debt, right, for our salvation to Christ or God or whatever. Right.
They quote the Nietzsche quote from Genealogy of Morals, right? That God making himself man to make the debt infinite by sacrificing himself for, I have thought about this some.
Because there's also perhaps even a master-slave relation, maybe, right? I don't know.
It's hard to say, right? It all depends on kind of like the emphasis you put on the syllable.
Yeah.
Because supposedly we're made in God's image, but eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, there is this intimation that we will become like gods and threaten God and his ascendancy. You can find that myth in a lot of different religions. You see it in Greek myth, right? That's why Prometheus is punished for bringing fire, bringing techne to man.
This is from earlier in the chapter, but I think it's interesting how they pointed out that the Greek gods hadn't been universalized. And so I think, right, Christ is sort of, this Roman Empire Christ thing is sort of universalizing Christianity.
Right.
Through how would you characterize Rome? Because it's not exactly it's not a capitalist quite economy.
Well, they call it a slave economy.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. That it has elements, and they quote quote Marx's, I guess this is in section 9. So we'll kind of, if we need to go back to 8, we will, but we can move forward. They quote section 9, they quote Marx's letter to, what is his name, Kailovsky, and it's the example of Rome specifically, where you have commodity production, you have a kind of proto or pseudo proletarianization of labor, you have all these different elements that could, again, even before the example they gave of China, where they shut down the mines, you have a lot of these conditions that seem necessary for the development of capitalism, and yet they are relatively dependent on the formation such that they can't conjoin, right, in the way that they say it. Whereas this is on 223, so the next page, they say, let us take the example of Rome. The decoding of landed flows through the privatization of property, the decoding of the monetary flows through the formation of great fortunes, the decoding of the commercial flows through the development of commodity production, the decoding of the producers through expropriation and proletarianization, all the preconditions are present. Everything is given without producing a capitalism, properly speaking, but rather a regime based on slavery. And that end note is to Marx's short letter, where you may have seen me tweet that out, the little section.
What's interesting here, and this may be a sort of way to propel us forward in the discussion, is that they did have a currency, right? They had a form of money. Although I don't know how that, that's getting a little bit far afield, I think, or at least stepping a little bit outside of my comfort zone in terms of being able to understand how the money functioned at that stage.
It is fascinating that we, not all coins are like this, not all currency, but definitely Rome gives an example of some early currency in our history. And one of the things that we still do is the relation of faciality to currency, right? The stamp of the emperor. So image. There are some emperors we really only know through sometimes just like statues. Sometimes historical information is scant when there were a bunch of emperors in a very short time, a little bit later. But a lot of emperors we know a little bit about through the stamping of their faciality on the coins. And it is kind of like, on the one hand, it is meant as a guarantor of value. We still practice this today with our dead presidents, with the exception of Benjamin Franklin, who kind of has his own little role in our nation's founding. He's still considered a founding father, even if he wasn't a president. So that just kind of shows it doesn't take an emperor anymore, right? The president in a democratic society is not an emperor. But on the other hand, it also kind of shows, it is the render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, right? It's being literally given the face of the despot, the dictator, that kind of goes back to the body with the organs of the despot, right? From, that sort of overcodes everything and everything flows back through him. All the organs are plugged into the despotic machine, right. And so that faciality is kind of, is a relation through which to connect and conjoin our flows and our servitude, to a supposedly benevolent representation of the dictator on the face of the coin. It is also this whole history of metallurgy and mercantile flows that they'll get into in 1,000 Plateaus. They don't really get into it much here, but they do mention over and over again that one of the things that capitalism does one of the main chief dividers between pre-capitalist societies and capitalist societies for them, right, is that we're no longer functioning on coding systems, right? We're no longer functioning on an accounting system, on a system of whether it be codes or overcodes. Now it is the axiomatic of decoded flows. And it, just like capitalism can reach its limit and then push it back and displace it, the axiomatic system can do the same thing and just provide a new axiom for wage laborers, for credit money, for financing. Each little singularity can be provided its own little axiom, which, as they say, is due to its impersonality, right? Due to its kind of, as Baudrillard might say, it's like floating, metamorphic, almost like monstrous, many-headed aspect. Each thing having its own axiom, that it makes it colder and crueler than the system of cruelty. It makes it more terrifying than the terror of the despotic machine. This is partly how they define the cynicism of it, right? But the other thing I would say about Rome, your question, reminds me of Freud. I believe it's at the beginning of Civilization and Its Discontents. He gives this great metaphor, and it is a metaphor, but it's great, where he's talking about the unconscious, and he describes the unconscious like Rome. And he says, like, imagine a Rome where we can kind of ignore the evolution of time and go back and coexisting. We can see the little hillside encampments on Palatine, right? And we can see each new layer on top of each other, and they all coexist, right? Up to the great empire that it became. We can kind of see coexisting, everything back to the first little shepherds and herdsmen kind of gathering together, right? That's how he kind of uses this metaphor for the unconscious too, because for him, the unconscious is kind of ignorant of time. It's ignorant of temporal development. Everything kind of coexists side by side in a way that's not spatially, not in the sense in which we live. We can only kind of understand that in a metaphorical way, because that's not how Rome exists. Even the best excavators can only get so far to say, here's perhaps where the first circle, the first distribution of Rome is, right? That kernel, that little seed that would become Rome. You know, we don't really have the necessary technology or science to be able to say with specific, like, here's the first stone laid, right?
You're speaking of time, so just was curious if you think this bit about the diachronic and synchronic times is that like worth exploring? I'll read the quote. It's a little bit further down on the page. It says, "For the founders of the state come like lightning. The despotic machine is synchronic, while the capitalist machine's time is diachronic. The capitalists appear in succession in a series that institutes a kind of creativity of history, a strange menagerie, the schizoid time of the new creative break."
This notion of a new creative break sounds kind of like when Nietzsche describes the breaking of history in two. And I think that's kind of, they may not be thinking of that quote in particular, but that's basically what they're implying with capitalism. And it doesn't just break history in two, it institutes a totally different form of time. The schizoid time is, you know, I kind of think about it as the fact that they'll keep saying this throughout this section, where even when capitalism was first starting to be made possible with industrial revolution and these technical developments like the cotton gin and the steam engine, yada, yada, they keep saying that it takes time to develop. It's not something that just like the state where it's all of a piece. And this is part of the axiomatic, right? That it keeps reaching its limit and its interior limit and making a new axiom and pushing that limit back. Right. And we've talked about this in other situations where it's like that which seems initially to threaten capitalism and threaten it with collapse can be commodified, and a new axiom can be made for it. You know, maybe even in the beginnings of capitalism, you might think of banning certain publications for their dangerous ideas, whether it be communistic or anarchistic or whatnot. And now you can buy the collected works of Marx, whatever. It's not a threat. It's so much not a threat that it can be made a new commodity, right? It can be made a new gross product.
That whole bit reminded me a little bit, because they go into the falling rate of profit.
Yeah.
To me, I'll table that. But the displacing of the internal limit sort of reminded me of capitalism's reliance on the boom and bust cycle, because it's almost like
the crises.
Yeah, exactly. The crises are built into the function of the system, right? The breakdowns only propel it to work better, right?
The more it breaks down, the more it works the American way, right? Which they say
exactly
much earlier on. But go on.
Well, I don't know if I had much else exactly, but I was wondering if that was sort of along the lines of what they were getting at with the displacing of the internal limit, because that's the first thing I thought of was how. Yeah, but I don't know, that it seems to attach more towards an almost binary flow back and forth between reterritorialization and deterritorialization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because there's so much entropy builds up in the system of flows that it has to totally there has to be a resetting. And within the resetting, there's sort of a creative destruction. It's almost like, you know, you set a forest fire on intentionally, right? To sort of eliminate the potential for revolution, one might say. Or like the revolutionary flows of desire. And because that's a pretty good, I think, metaphor relative to the conflagration, right? There's a lot of tinder building up in our system. We got to set that shit on fire. We got to like churn the dead, the weak, the dead sort of have to be excommunicated and reincorporated within the system.
Right.
And also the inertia of capital has to finally kind of feels like it maybe stalls out, like the flow sort of stalls out. It can only go so far before it has to be reset in order to reaccumulate and reassert itself. And in so doing, it's playing with the coding and overcoding. I don't know. This is kind of the track I was on with this.
I mean, it's interesting because like Deleuze is like, look, codes, relatively speaking, can still coexist in capitalism, but capitalism doesn't care about it. We don't care about it. We don't believe in it anymore, right? That's part of, the whole adage about, the way to kill a god is to take away its believers. It's kind of similar, where there's this slow and infinitesimal death by a million cuts that the codes undergo and the overcodes. And it's the same thing that Lyotard says when he's like, look, capitalism could easily find ways of justifying itself. And there are people who do that. We know that they're neoconservatives and they're all kinds of supporters of the capitalist way of life. But what his point being is, like, capitalism doesn't care about morally justifying itself, or, right. I mean, that's part of how the axiomatic works, right? Because the codes, in a certain sense, in the way like Nietzsche understands religion, the only way a religion lives is through ritual, right? And so, the system of coding required rituals, right? Required the chief saying, let's live like the ancestors did. Let's live in harmony with their way of life, and we will ourselves have prosperity. And so it implies a kind of conservatism, a kind of traditionalism. It implies the life and blood of performing rituals. That's the only way that the codes and the religions live on. And
as a form of, is it a form of inscription? Well, yeah, I mean, it is a form of kind of inscription, huh? I guess.
Yeah, I mean, through performance.
Right.
And it can be an immaterial inscription in a certain way, the way we understood the gift as being imbued with these symbolic and spiritual forces that kind of burn a hole in your pocket and kind of force you to counter gift. But in this sense, and this is interesting too, in this sense, if capitalism is born and in fact feeds off of and functions off of decoded flows and deterritorializations, this is why it's not so simple to say that deterritorialization is good,
right,
in and of itself.
Correct.
Or that decoding is good in and of itself.
Yeah.
But the paradox is that they kind of end this section. I'm anticipating a bit again, but they end this section by saying, like, look, do we follow Samir Amin with his almost fascist option? It's fascist in the sense that it resembles the fascist option. It's not itself fascist. But do we follow Samir Amin and say, look, the third world countries that are actually providing the surplus value for the center, for the first world countries, do we encourage them to leave the global market? Or is perhaps the way out is the way you have to go through it?
Right.
Do you accelerate the process of deterritorialization? Do you accelerate the process of decoding? Have we just not? And Guattari in some of his writings, even later, still kind of adheres to this, where he's like, look, we need more shit. We need more gadgets. We need more gizmos. Keep pushing and keep going. Now, in A Thousand Plateaus, they revisit this, and this is where relative deterritorialization versus absolute deterritorialization comes into play, and how even one of the things standing in the way of absolute deterritorialization is precisely the axiomatic system.
Could you clarify the axiomatic? Because I often hear axiomatic singular of capitalism, but then in reading, like, there seems to be a whole array of different axioms that could function or exist at any given arrangement within the social.
One of the ways I try to think about it is, we know from our studies of the territorial machine and the despotic machine that flows and codes are kind of like content and expression. They come together, right? They are complementary. And they describe that the flows are getting decoded and overcoded at the same time. Or I know the flows are getting decoded and something else is occurring at the same time. They say it's like a simultaneous process. Right. Maybe that's from later on in the book or the chapter, though. Well, yeah, it is a simultaneous process. I mean, like, I guess the thing with say the territorial machine, and even with the despotic machine, as we saw when the Chinese emperors or bureaucrats shut down the mines once a certain stock was filled, right? So we think about how in gift economies, in symbolic exchange, as Baudrillard talks about, markets for exchange where, say, money function as an abstract equivalent, they are dependent and they are cordoned off and they are very specific. They are not given free reign. They don't become independent. The blacksmiths, metallurgical inventions, the technicians, mediations with the unknown object, the merchant, and the function of money is all very circumscribed and tightly kept dependent upon the social formations, kept watch over, and not allowed to take on the autonomy that we see in capitalist societies. In the first chapters of Capital, right, Marx goes through how the technical development of metallurgy, for example, is one of the necessary prerequisites for silver and gold becoming, they're at once a commodity and yet also the commodity form for any other commodity to be translated into. And today we've even even if gold is still one of those things, it's a safe bet. We're based on credit on this kind of faith, right? So that's a totally another thing. But that's a part of, I think, the axiomatic, right? It's a part of this notion that what's even more decoded and deterritorialized than gold and silver as the abstract equivalent of every other commodity as a money form. Yeah. It's precisely faith, right? Literally credit.
Full credit and faith, rather.
Yeah, full faith and credit of the
faith and credit. Yeah.
The whatever. Yeah, FDIC insured, all this stuff, right? That is an axiomatic development, right? And it's axiomatic in the sense in which it's no longer related to any codes. It is this monstrous development whereby part of the development of the axiomatic and working on decoded flows, the two major elements that they always come back to in the conjunction, the encounter that was missed earlier, is the decoding of free labor. We're no longer slaves. We're no longer indentured servants. We're all given the freedom of selling our labor.
Did they describe this as the destruction, or classes are not? Because class gets brought up about how, I guess, the capitalist machine eliminates classes or something. There's only one class, the bourgeois class. Or something.
You're right. That's right. And for them, classes are the negative of castes and other social formations. Right. It's kind of like capitalism is a negative of pre-capitalist societies. And the other, obviously, which we kind of talked about a second ago, the other decoded flow is the abstract equivalent. Right, the abstract general equivalent of money. It's become even more abstract.
I mean, with something like Bitcoin, right? That's a further deteriorization
That's even more,
of money, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You think? I guess at blockchain, we should say, broadly speaking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
Do you think Guattari? It sounds like he would have been like, yeah, fucking do NFTs, whatever. Yeah, like whatever.
Obviously, he would have.
Would he
saw this? He would have seen this as another acceleration, right? That we were talking about, accelerating the process. But you can be sure that he would have reservations too,
right?
I mean, this is one of the things with Deleuze and Guattari, where for every kind of how do I say? I mean, for every potential deterritorialization, they are always very cautious, right? When they talk about making yourself a body without organs, they're like, you can fuck it up. You can botch, you can deterritorialize too quickly, which is why Deleuze, he even seems more conservative than Guattari on this point, but Deleuze is like, look, I'm not going to, and he was an alcoholic and stuff, and he understands what addiction is. He kind of saying like, look, I'm not saying, for the youth of the world to, go out, yes, experiment, you can do drugs, but there's a way of relying on drugs as a substitute for other means of exploring your body without organs or whatever, of forming it. There's a way in which it literally becomes the substitute for other types of searching, other types of becoming nomadic or becoming imperceptible, or all the different becoming intense. There's a way in which the drug use itself can lure us in with the pleasure, and we kind of only then, almost like we need that dopamine drip, right? We need that. We become interested. Yeah, we become interested in the pleasure for pleasure's sake, and that itself is a kind of slavery, right? That is itself a kind of subordination And in a way, it's also a means of, that's the balancing line for Deleuze, right? It's like, okay, I understand what it means to cope in a fucked up world. And that can be a part of regaining strength. But there's a way in which our coping can easily swing into a kind of ressentiment, a kind of reactionary.
I mean, who better fits this description than our good friend, Mr. Outsideness himself?
I actually was talking to, I forget who I was talking. I was talking to my wife about this, where she had just woken up, and I was like, Coop posted, I said I woke up with Space Oddity in my head because I was singing it. And she's like, your tweet was something like ground control to
Major Gnon. Yeah.
Major Gnon. And I was like, yeah, she just woken up. She's not awake, not had her coffee. I'm like, yeah, Coop, he's interested in this notion of Gnon. And I was like trying to explain it to her and not doing a good job. And she's like, what the fuck are you talking about? And so I was like, oh, well, it's from one of this Deleuzian guy, he kind of went off the grid and moved to China and supposedly did a lot of meth. And now he's a little bit fascist and problematic. And, I was trying to say, like, first of all, reading too much Deleuze doesn't necessarily make you. I was trying to talk about how there's like in vino veritas, where I was like, because she's like, oh, you think he did a bunch of meth and became a fascist? I was like, no, I don't think that's how it works, right? There's a lot of meth heads who aren't necessarily.
Yeah, right. Good point. Good point.
It's kind of more bringing out the truth of ourselves, right? But that's a great example of using drugs in a way to explore for better or worse, right? I mean, like, let's not say that Land botched anything, right? I mean, let's say that he uncovered his truth and is doing the best he can, as we all are, to sort of come to grips with the world.
I don't know. I think you're right, though. There's a certain amount of ressentiment that seems to color his whole vibe these days.
I won't judge him or his choices or whatever, and he shares his thoughts, some of which are even now still profound. But sometimes you don't vibe with others on that level. Sometimes even to try to grasp the diamonds out of the rough, it can be harmful for one's own psychic and spiritual forces. So I don't really have anything personally against him or his work. Just, it's not for me. And I think that's kind of how like Proust talks about his work. He's like, look, the book is meant to be a mirror and you're supposed to read into yourself. If it's not the right machine for that, if it's not the right apparatus, find something else, right? Find something that works for you. I also think Deleuze and Guattari are kind of trying to teach us that too, right? What they're kind of like, look, see if it works and how it works. And if it works for you, if it furthers, your ambitions or what you're searching for, right? We're all searching. If it works, then do something with it.
Right. I don't know. I just got the impression from, I guess, really, perhaps just looking back at the entire reading of the book up to this point, is that this is two things. It's the manifesto for, like, you can draw a clear line to accelerationism from this book.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
You could even say, I don't know, it's like the manifesto for accelerationism in a sense. It's certainly the manifesto, I think, to give it that moniker for libidinal economy.
Yeah, for taking libidinal economy seriously.
Yeah,
not as
exactly.
Not as a parody of anything.
Right, yeah, exactly.
The way they end the section where they say, accelerate deterritorialization and decoding, it also vibes very much with Lyotard's call to accelerate decadence in the Nietzschean sense, in the sense in which he develops it, right, where it is about the destruction of values and not about restoring old values. And Deleuze and Guattari have their own way of talking about this. We'll see that more in chapter 4, where they're like, there are ways of investing desire in such a way that we desire the resurrection and the restoration of the old body,
right,
of the old body without organs.
I have a personal example that pertains to this. I think, well, kind of, and I've talked about this before, and as far as like growing up in a small town, and I think I've used Durkheim's terminology of mechanical versus organic solidarity. Mm-hmm. So it's in the smaller social group, there's an organic solidarity, there's a coding, right? The coding, coding in the sense of there are clear behavioral things that you must do if you are a certain type of person. Like if you're a male, you're supposed to play football, right? Or there's there's regulations on behavior that are a lot more, let's say, I guess, apparent, right? Or they're a lot more apparent and they're enforced a lot more strictly or followed more strictly, right? By the social, which in this way is a very, in a sense, there's a liberty in the, well, I don't want to say liberty, but there is a freeing of anxiety in having a prescribed role and kind of knowing, okay, this is my path. So I have less anxiety. I can follow the clear codes within the social and say, okay,
right,
I'm this, I'm that, I'm supposed to do this. Okay, great. I do my role, etc. within the body without organs. On the flip side of that, there is that's very repressive in a sense. There's a social repression that goes on. And personally, at least consciously, I did not enjoy the strict coding of the small town because it's like everybody knows your business. It's closed-minded. It's this bubble. My father had a bad reputation in the town, so that I like inherited this fucking reputation.
The sins of the father. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so in that way, I'm like, fuck that shit. I hate that shit. I hate the religion element plays a role too because of
course,
that's a big part of the social coding. The decoded flows would be something like a major city, right? Because the codes are scrambled. Like there's a lot more freedom to choose whatever path you want to take. The flip side of that, on the other side of the ledger, is you have to take on some certain anxiety in knowing what to become.
Yeah. Yeah, you don't have a pre-established model anymore.
You don't have a pre-established model, which can cause anxiety, but there's a certain liberation to it. And so I think I would rather be on the side of the decoded flows in that sense. Yeah, or at least a somewhat more decoded social, because of this repressive, you're determined by the social or whatever. Like that is one good aspect of the decoded flows or capitalism that I think Guattari is kind of recognizing this. But I don't know if you have any thoughts on that or if you think this is even relevant. I could cut it out if you don't.
Oh, I think it's totally relevant. No, I do think it's totally relevant. I mean, it's this notion of we always hear it asked, what do you want to be when you grow up? Sometimes it's said, what do you want to do? But a lot of times it's, what do you want to be? Right. And what you're kind of showing, and I growing up in Georgia, maybe in a slightly bigger town, but still a small town in Georgia, I faced a lot of the same things that you're talking about, where for the most part, there are very narrow channels that you get to navigate.
Right.
There's, in a certain sense, there aren't a lot of freedoms. And part of that is for certain types of people. And, maybe for a young person, when you're still potentially able to become anything, it provides a lot of structure, right? It provides a lot of reassurance. It becomes easier to make decisions and it narrows down your options. On the one hand, that can feel like security and stability.
Right. Yes.
In like Brave New World and the utopia, it is about identity, security, stability, right? It is about this thing where sort of everything's already plotted out for you. You already know which caste you're in based on your biological decanting. You are kind of assigned roles. You don't have to make, everything's kind of pre-planned for you. And, as you were saying, that is, we can call it a recoding or an overcoding or the resilience and residues of coding. We could also talk about it in terms of reterritorialization. I mean, you brought up Christianity and the Christian church and the function of, I went to a small church, a non-denominational church. And you talk about the holier than thou thing. It is a kind of reinforcing of the superego, for example.
Yes.
Right. Because for me, I know that Freud, there's a simplification of Freud, and he does vacillate on this a little bit, but this notion of a kind of superego is this internalized authority figure, usually based on the image of the parent, even sometimes just the father, right? Which we know Lacan kind of develops in the name of the father and all that stuff.
There's a guilt. There's a guilt present in the debt is the guilt for the sacrifice of Christ. So
right.
produces endless guilt.
And the guilt is
in the way that the gifts are inhabited by spirits, and you want to get rid of that, right? It's almost the inverse with the debt. Well, not the inverse exactly, but you know what I'm saying.
There's no equivalent counter gift.
Right.
There's no,
which matches on to capitalism, right?
There's no symbolic exchange that can be. The only way to pay back the infinite debt of Christ's sacrifice is to live in accordance with the codes and norms and values that are established by whatever sect of Christianity and whatever norm and value of the society within which you live, the little town, that you're talking about. That's the only way to counter gift it, is to sort of live a Christian life and believe, repent, and be baptized and all of that, and confess your sins. All of that stuff is a way of more deeply rooting the internalization of the guilt of the superego, and sort of internalizing that panopticon that's always kind of watching over our actions, even with the myth of Santa Claus, which seems benevolent on the surface. Yeah, Santa Claus is all-seeing, and the gifts you receive are supposed to reflect your behavior in the past year. So if you get a lump of coal, you've been a bad boy. And if you want gifts, you better act correctly. So it's a way of reinforcing behavior protocols and a way of reinforcing quote unquote good behavior based on criteria that aren't within your purview, right? They're determined for you. And, that type of punishment reward system is a function of social and psychic repression, right? It is the kind of thing where, because, in the Bible, it vacillates. For me, at least my reading of the Bible, it vacillates where so much of the Bible is kind of, you have the extremes of kind of Solomon and Ecclesiastes saying, the sun shines on the evil and the good and the wicked alike, right? You do also have this kind of thing where performing good acts and living with faith, you will be rewarded. But on the other hand, you have the conundrum of someone like Job, right? Yeah. Who is faced with an immoral type of situation, or an amoral type of situation, where morality does not equate with prosperity, where morality is not the factor, where the world, the universe is, and God himself is an amoral character. When Job finally breaks down and asks why, God's just like, because. That's the figure of authority, right? Where it's, Zizek's good on this, where he's like, he prefers the conservative traditionalist father over the liberal father, right? Because the liberal father uses guilt to get you to do what he wants, whereas the conservative father tells you that you must, and doesn't provide a reasoning, doesn't reason with you, doesn't try to insinuate guilt, where he's like, we're going to grandma's. That's it. But the liberal father is like, well, don't you know your grandma she'd really like to see you, and she would be so sad if you didn't come on the trip with us, all that shit. That's how I got, when I stopped wanting to go to church, I was like, I'm done with this shit. When I was 12, that's what my mom and dad tried to do. It was kind of like, oh, don't you know everybody wants to see you? Don't you want to be a good boy and all that crap? Yeah. Instead of it being like, no, you're going to fucking church. Get out of bed. Yeah.
That's funny, because either my grandfather or my dad would make me go to church.
And they wouldn't try to guilt trip you. They would just say, you're going.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And to a certain extent, that is more preferable. It's not saying it's ideal or the best thing, where, the best thing obviously would be like, just, I didn't like it. I hated it. I mean, that's kind of why, even on my other side, like my mom's second husband, they would make me go to church when I would visit them too. And I'm like, fuck that shit. Yeah. Yeah.
Forcing me to go to this.
I hated the hypocrisy of all the holier than thou people at church. There were some good people.
Yeah, for sure.
But so much of the history of the church, even though it is starting to change, and we have a good pope, now. I'm not a Catholic, but a more liberal pope who's who tends to have messages that are at odds with the immense conservatism and dogma and doctrine of the church historically. But and you're slowly seeing like Episcopalian churches allowing for women to be preachers or more accepting of the gay community and stuff like that. But but the church that you and I grew up in, where homosexuality is an eternal sin.
All sins are created equal, but this one,
right? That one, homosexuality being, and you have to. How do you justify that except go back to Leviticus? You have to use these.
It's so weird how that works, right?
Yeah,
like, that's a very strange phenomenon. Not even on the Catholic side. The Catholic side, I think, is even makes a little more sense. It's like less hypocritical than the Protestant side.
Well, because for the Catholics, everything is pretty much written down and clear what the church has decided upon.
Right.
Even if the Pope is decoding a little bit of these things.
It's the decoding of the flows, though, that they see that it's the decoding of the flows that Protestants don't like.
Each sect has its own, and each little community has its own ways of emphasizing the codes when they see someone stepping out of line or when they see someone pursuing types of becoming that are anathema to their values.
Yeah, exactly.
Homosexuality being one of them. When I was growing up, transsexuality wasn't even, that wasn't even brought up in church, but you can imagine it easily could have been. It would have just been lumped in with the homophobia and the misogyny. And in some churches, not my church, thank God, but I had a friend who wanted to become a preacher. Really, really nice guy. He took me to church one day. I was probably 16. First time I've been to a Southern Baptist church, and it had all of the bigotry lumped into one sermon. Homophobia, misogyny, racism, all that shit. Just a smorgasbord of reactive and reactionary forces. That kind of stuff is a part of the reterritorializations of subjectivity, and it is, in a certain extent, at odds with capitalism. But capitalism can make another axiom for it and say, no, that's fine. We can market homophobia. We can market sexism and misogyny and racism. There's a market for that.
Yeah.
Right.
It's interesting in how those things persist in that way. So
that's where I think Deleuze and Guattari have to say that coding or residues of coding still coexist in capitalism.
Yeah.
Because to a certain extent, capitalism can make a buck off of it. Right? Capitalism can get a surplus value out of it, even if it itself doesn't have to espouse any upkeep of religion or ritual. It can still allow for an axiom where it says, okay, well, within this little sector of this little zone of desire, this little zone of power, homophobia can be a commodity just like anything else.
Because it's going to intelligently direct its investments efficiently.
Yeah, it's going to diversify its assets.
It's going to look at the social and say, well, I don't really have to expend as much resources towards this. Flows will go in this direction a lot more aggressively or whatever. Right.
So it's this is kind of why Deleuze and Guattari end up where they do at the end of this our section for today, saying perhaps the way out is through. Perhaps the way to accelerating the process is the only way to sort of bring the resonance of the crises that are only incremental and
built in,
temporary and separated to accelerate it so much that the crises can't like shake the edifice, that shake the movement of the displacement of the limits, right? That it's kind of like the way they talk about shattering Oedipus, right? The triangle of Oedipus. I think that's what we'll kind of see when we finish this chapter and when we move on to chapter 4 is chapter 4 is going to be like, okay, what is schizoanalysis going to offer us that psychoanalysis can't?
Mm-hmm.
And how is that going to change our views? Because to a certain extent, it does seem like they are pessimistic. I think that's the thing. You can't just be naively optimistic. You do have to have a kind of Hegelian negation of the negation. You do have to go kind of through the dark night. You have to have that dark night of the soul, the negative path, in order to then affirm. I think that's what we'll see. I think that things are going to be brighter. Like the sun will come out next chapter.
I wanted to go back before I forget and just clarify on the Durkheim shit about mechanical and organic solidarity, because I think I mistakenly said organic would be the smaller social groups when that's mechanical, which makes, even they say mechanical.
The homogeneity of individuals.
Correct.
Right?
Filial relations, etc. versus, and so it's enforced by coding versus the organic would be the more like deterritorialized or decoded flows. The decoded flows map onto organic solidarity would be I should just say that.
Yeah. So in a certain sense, we live in different times. This is part of maybe the schizoid time of the diachrony where, growing up in a small town, we are submitted to mechanical solidarity, and yet that the town is open to an outside, right? As your circle widens, the different segmentations, we see that there is an organic side that's always on the periphery and even, insinuated in the center, but we do live in both times. And that's also part of childhood and child rearing, although that may change more, but we do see that the homogeneity is a value. That's kind of what we've been talking about and what you and I both struggled against. Again, for some people, homogeneity can feel safe and secure and comfortable. Right?
The anonymity to me is what I love about the city. It was a breath of fresh air when I moved out, and it was like, oh, well, nobody knows who the fuck I am or anything. They don't.
You can be anybody.
Yeah, exactly. I'm not my father's son. I'm just a guy, right? Like there's a whole opening up of possibility there.
It's becoming imperceptible.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, there is a freedom to that. And as you said, it does come with a bit of anxiety, but part of the anxiety is not always, but some of anxiety, at least elements of it is kind of like the nervousness one feels before one has to perform, like go on stage or at a like a sports events. I mean, you and I both played a lot of sports, and that anxiety, that nervousness is kind of the prelude to that adrenaline rush.
Yeah, precisely.
And so there is that freedom. It is terrifying on the one hand.
Fear keeps me alive.
But exhilarating too. Yeah. Fear keeps you alive, right?
Weakness keeps me alive.
By the next time we record, I'm going to get to the fucking bottom of some of the stuff about surplus code and surplus value. And I had some ideas to get into it, but this is probably a good stopping point. Yeah, I think.
And
one of the things that I always like, hopefully the listeners enjoy, is when we aren't just two disembodied voices, but when we talk about our personal lives, right? We actually talk real life examples.
That'll be the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins signing off for the week.
The very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is unconscious character. To the whole state of things, pure violence without option anymore. This is a typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here. What I meant is the following.
With nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people, as in Clockwork Orange.